Okay, Adriana or Ellie, who's gonna light this off? Or are you guys waiting on me?
No, I believe Fred is our speaker.
Oh, okay. I'm not hearing no feedback. It's hard for me sometimes. Shall we roll into this?
I think we should.
Great. Well, hello, other people. I can't see you, but I hope you can see me. And I am extremely happy to be here in the Sonoma County Forest Conservation Working Group workshop, which is brought to you by a whole bunch of great folks. And we're here to talk about the fires and how to recover from the fires through your forest. And this is going to be specifically about how do you look at trees, how do you evaluate the site, how do you look at the ground and the land that you've got, and what are the tools that you can use to start doing that. So welcome to our workshop. Adriana, do you want to explain what Sonoma Strong is?
Sure. Yeah, this is just our way of saying we're here in solidarity with all of you who have been victims of the fire. And we know that through this hard time, we'll make it through because we are a resilient community. We work together, we learn together, and yeah, we're here for you.
Great. And I should say, my name is Fred Ufrat. I've been doing forestry for 30 some odd years. I'm a landowner up Mill Creek, and I had 400 acres that my family's been taking care of since 1960, and that torched out in the Wallbridge fire. We lost 400 of 400 acres, or they burned. And maybe I should say, we didn't lose them. They're still there, but they sure are different right now. And some of them burned very hard and some of it didn't. So I'm a test case as well as a forester. And I also teach when we are having classes at Santa Rosa Junior College, and I teach the forestry class here. And thrillingly, some of my students are in on this call, including Adriana. Next slide, please. Oh, there we are. So who are we? We're the Sonoma County Forest Conservation Working Group. We got put together with Dee Swanheiser and myself and some great folks over the Open Space District and the Resource Conservation District and Department of Forestry, and decided we'd be a hand-holding organization with each other to talk about issues in Sonoma County about forests. You know, Sonoma County is about 50% or more forest land, depending on how you define it. And so we've got everything from redwoods to oak forests to grasslands with occasional trees, to knobcone pines, to 20 kinds of oaks. So we've got a lot of forest to be concerned about. So we are concerned about managing forests and keeping them healthy across space and time, if you will. So that we want to take the long view on forests, and we also want to deal with them on a daily level. So thus here it says we're a network for land managers, service providers, researchers. We check in with each other to become a catalyst for collaborative projects. And we also are a point of contacts for landowners so they can find information that is going to help them manage their forest. Because at the end of the day, we all manage the forest together. It is one forest. We are Sonoma Strong. We have one forest. We try and take care of it. Next slide, please. So this workshop, which I should say is also being pushed forward by UC Cooperative Extension and a host of other partner organizations, has some real good experts on it, in it. And I'll tell you, walking through my forest after it was burned, I felt very downhearted. However, walking with the experts, suddenly they're all saying, hey, these trees are alive. I don't know why you're sad. Fall came a little bit early. So we're going to take some steps so that you can assess your burned property and maybe lift a little of that ash cloud off of your heart. Find you some resources for technical help and funding. A lot of those people are in on this call, and what to expect as we move forward here. I mean, everybody says this is going to be a disaster. Well, maybe it's not as bad as you think. Maybe we're going to do okay. We will not be talking about pre-fire planning. Fire Safe Sonoma and a lot of CAL FIRE are very good at working with landowners for how do you keep your house safe? How do you keep your space defensible? That's not what today is about. This is for looking at your burned forest. Okay, let's keep going. So I have these up here. I know that slideshows aren't the best when somebody just reads the slides to you, but we're sort of using these as little kickoff spaces for ideas. So let's see where you fall in here. Post-fire safety risks. Have you considered hazard trees? How dangerous is it for you to be out there? Let's consider how we can make you safe. How do you evaluate your property and evaluate potential risks? Just walking around can be very difficult. We were marking trees and kept falling into hot holes. That was exciting. There are mistakes that are being made in responding to fire. We've been learning over the last few years, so let's see what the experts have to say about that. Let's see what those experts can say about getting money and tech assistance to you. Can you replace your own culverts? Things like that. How do you support wildlife? What should you expect in the post-fire landscape? I'm very excited about hearing that. The woodpeckers and I have been talking a lot. And how are we going to look at our weeds and invasive plants? What is an invasive plant? And why you work with your neighbors. My neighbor and I have never been closer since we discovered that the logging road really is on both of our properties. So we're all moving together. Keep going. Next slide, please. These are just, these are books here by a lot of the experts that you're hearing today. And these are not the only books on this subject, but it does tell you what sort of books you're going to want to look at. Assessing tree damage and mortality is terribly important. Erosion concerns, when do you need to do that? Again, looking at wildlife. Next slide, please. Looking at weeds and taking a long-range view. And all of us are going to be looking particularly at that, taking the long-range view, because it's important that you you feel good moving through into this. Our next slide was going to be a map of the fire intensity. I'll be trying to kick that up for the end. But right now, let's talk about how do we do a Zoom meeting. Ellie, can you take it?
Yeah, the little etiquette, little things to talk about here. Use the chat to ask questions. And you can also raise your hand. It took me 6 months to figure this out. If you go into the participants, you click on participants and you'll see there's an option for raising your hand. That's another way to go about it. And we ask you all, it looks like it's been done, to mute your mic or your phone unless you're speaking, and even turn off your video. I'm not sure if people can even turn it on, but it helps with the bandwidth. Also want to note that this workshop is being recorded and will be available afterwards. People always want to know that. It will be recorded and available to all the participants. And then if you have friends who want to see it, you can forward the link for that. And in a minute, as soon as we're done here, Adriana will be doing a quick and easy poll during the meeting. And I guess that's my quick little 15 seconds of fame. Adriana, do you want to move on to the poll? Yeah, and I'm not sure if, yeah, Adriana's muted right now, but we're going to have, the poll is going to pop up on your screen, and it's only 5 questions. It'll go really, really quickly. And I'm not seeing it yet, but
There we go.
here we go. Yeah. So just take your time going through, and we'll be looking at it, and it's really helpful to the speakers to get a chance to see how these questions are answered, so we can target our presentations to those of you who are here. I feel like there should be some background music.
Please let us know if anyone's having a hard time viewing the poll.
Yeah, again, you can put a note in the chat, or you can raise your hand in the participants. there's a question here from, looks like Roberta. I am seeing the poll, so let us know if you're not in the chat. Yeah, we do have a vote for music, if anybody would like to pipe it in.
I didn't come that prepared, but that's a good idea for next time.
I'm sure someone out there has some music they might want to put on. I'm just kidding.
Great, results are coming in. Keep them coming. We'll take a few more minutes for this. Just want to say, so far, a lot of people are responding that the thing they most hope to learn from this webinar is how to evaluate issues on their own property, doing it themselves by walking through. And it's really interesting for our presenters to know. Maybe they can speak to that, how to evaluate issues on their property as they do their presentations. Also, getting high votes is what issues to expect this winter and how to mitigate common winter issues. So hopefully our speakers will touch on that. And the top so far, some top concerns about the land that our attendees manage is really the burned trees. That's getting a lot of votes, as well as potential for landslides and other erosion dangers. Fair number of people are also talking about wanting to protect the creek on their property. That's interesting.
I want to mention one participant said she was unable to submit, and I suspect it may be because not all the questions were answered. It's possible that you need to answer all the questions before you can submit.
I'm not sure about that. Looks like Paula has raised her hand. Do you want to go ahead and speak, Paula?
Hi, thank you. I just don't know what supervisory district we're in.
Oh, okay. Why don't you just choose one just so that you can finish your
Okay.
poll?
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, we've got about half of the attendees have finished the poll, so we'll give it just one more minute and then we'll wrap up even if not everyone has finished the poll. Just to be time conscious. Seven of our attendees own more than 100 acres or have parcels that are larger than 100 acres. That's interesting. Glad to have some of our large acreage landowners with us. And then otherwise, we've got landowners across the spectrum from under 5 acres through to 40 acres or more. Yeah, we got the whole gamut here. A fair number of people say that they're working with their neighbors on recovery efforts. That's great. And where it's appropriate, I think it's really a good thing to do. It so helps having working with your neighbors because you guys can learn together, collaborate and cooperate, coordinate is what I meant to say. But there are also a fair number of folks who maybe don't feel comfortable with that or don't quite know how to approach their neighbors. We'll talk more about that. Okay. All right, I'm going to close the poll now. We've had 5 minutes. Thanks to those who have responded, and I think I will leave it there, and I'll just stop sharing my screen so that our next presenter, who is Michael Jones, can share his screen.
All right. Well, good evening. Thank you everyone for being here and also to the organizers of this meeting for having me present. So my name is Michael Jones. I am the UC Extension Forester for Mendocino Lake and Sonoma counties. And this evening, I'll be talking about assessing your trees for fire damage and determining survival and or mortality. So I always want to start out with this just as a reminder, and specifically when we're thinking about the material for this talk, that we live in a fire-adapted ecosystem. Most of the ecosystems in California are fire adapted, meaning that fire is a common and important disturbance that has shaped the native flora and fauna. And so since I'll be focusing on trees, I'm going to talk about two just kind of really neat life history strategies that they have evolved to deal with fire. So the first is fire tolerance. And so we typically think of trees that are fire tolerant as having characteristics like thick bark, self-pruning branches, meaning that the canopy, the bottom of the canopy is fairly high off the ground. These are typically a lot of our oaks, so blue oak, black oak, valley oak, coast live oak, or redwood. And then Douglas fir is also fire tolerant, though it's typically more tolerant of low severity fires. It doesn't do well with more and higher severity burns, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see in these images, the top left, that's, I forget now, I think that's interior live oak. We see that there's bark damage in the outer part of the bark, but the inner bark is still healthy and alive. The other really interesting strategy is essentially the complete opposite. So instead of being able to tolerate the fire, if I anthropomorphize this, we call this fire embracing. And essentially we think of trees that are fire embracing with characteristics like thin bark, and then a capacity to regenerate through sprouting, or maybe the sciroctonous, meaning they use fire for regeneration and they reseed or recruit a new generation. And these are typically our interior live oak, our interior live oak or scrub oak, most of our native hardwoods, all of our conifers except for redwoods. And you know, all oak species and redwood have the capacity to resprout, so they exhibit both tolerance and an ability to embrace. And really, what embracing is like I said, if I'm going to anthropomorphize this, is that the tree, instead of investing a lot of resources into defense mechanisms to tolerate damage from fire, it basically just kind of says, all right, I'm going to let the fire kill my above ground biomass, the part of the tree that we can see, and then use all the reserves that I have in my below ground biomass tissues, my root structures, my root ball, and all the tissues that are below ground to regenerate a new tree. And so that's kind of how we think about fire embracing. So when we are trying to assess fire damage, we're looking at, we kind of look at fire severity, which is the physical damage that fire does. So what are the ecological and the physical impacts left from the fire, right? Whereas fire intensity is kind of the chemistry and the physics of fire. And so the point is that fire severity is highly variable across the landscape, right? When we think about a landscape that's burned or an area that's burned, we don't expect to find one exact fire behavior, one exact fire severity. It's highly variable at the landscape level, even at the local scales. And it depends a lot on different factors, both things like topography, weather, and vegetation type. So remember that when you're out assessing your property, or the property that you manage, that fire behavior and fire severity will be highly variable. And so fire severity can be something like low severity on the left, where we see there's very little evidence of burning. In the middle, more moderate, where we start to see some understory mortality of the vegetation, some more damage to the trees, to a high severity fire in this particular stand, where we saw a significant amount of biomass consumption and mortality. But even a stand like this has capacity to recover, and most of these trees in this photo and most of the vegetation in this photo actually ended up resprouting. So there's very little true mortality, even in a stand that experienced fire of that severity. So how do we look at fire severity, then use those kinds of metrics to assess damage and predict survival? So we look at four things. We look at bark scorching, cambium damage, root damage, and canopy torching. I'll talk about these in more detail next. But basically, we're looking at the damage from the fire. And so it's kind of maybe intuitive, but bigger trees typically have better defense mechanisms and are more tolerant of fire, whereas smaller trees are less tolerant. And conifers are typically not tolerant or weakly tolerant when compared to hardwoods or redwoods. And I'm going to, I know redwood's technically a conifer, but it's its own weird alien of a tree, so it kind of sits all by itself. So when we look at bark scorching, we're looking at the consumption and the bark splitting, which can indicate woody tissue damage. So on the left, we see low severity bark damage where really the only thing that was burned was the moss and lichens that were on the bark. The architecture and structure of the bark is still there. Middle, we have more extreme damage, more high severity damage where the bark was completely consumed and the wood was burning. But on the left side of that center photo, we see cracks. And so cracking, even if the bark isn't completely consumed, cracking really indicates there's a lot of heat, a lot of drying. There's probably damage to those woody tissues under the bark, which is not good. And then you can see when it burns really hot on these redwoods, it completely consumed what was very thick bark and burned all the way to the wood. So that's a good sign of some pretty significant damage to that tree. The best indication of whether a tree will survive or not is to look at the cambium. So the cambium in a little diagram is this really important layer of tissue that's just below the bark and sits on top of the wood. And if that is damaged and the entire circumference of the tree is girdled, we call it, where the entire cambium is killed, you can expect this above ground biomass mortality in our hardwoods and redwoods, or a true mortality in our other conifers. And so typically on larger trees, greater than 50% of that circumference is damaged, we're going to expect possible mortality. Smaller trees can't tolerate that much. But what you see in the photos on the bottom left, is we have the outer bark is damaged, and you see that margin, and the inner bark, this kind of creamier color is the healthy bark, and then this white creamy tissue is your cambium. Healthy cambium has a wet, moist texture to it, and it has this creamy color. In the center photo, we see the bark was completely killed and damaged, and then the wood itself was killed. And so this is all dead cambium. It has a kind of dulled color. It's dry. Here's a redwood. This side, here you can see healthy bark, this healthy cambium, and then here's the kind of the side where the cambium is dead. So the best way to really assess the damage to the cambium is to hack through the bark and look at it. But with redwoods, you have a cool kind of tool that we can use. We call it redwood sounding. And because that's fibrous bark, you can kind of hammer it pretty hard. So you take an axe, the blunt side of an axe or a hammer, and you hit the tree really hard. And if you get a thud, that means the tissue's living, means there's a lot of water in there, it's still healthy and alive. If you get an echo, that means the wood is dry and dead. And so that's kind of a way to do a quick assessment of the cambium damage to your redwoods. We also look at root damage. Again, more than 50% of the circumference of the tree has root damage. It's pretty significant. And the tree will likely have issues, the above ground biomass portion of that tree will likely have issues surviving, or you're going to lose your conifer. Even if it's less than that much of the circumference, you can have structural issues. Think about if you lose a portion of the root structure, which is the anchoring system for the tree, that tree could have potential to fail. You can look for root damage by looking right at the root collar at the base of the tree. You can see there's a lot of damage in here. And then also you'll see these root cavities where the roots burned out. And so that's a pretty good sign that there is significant root damage to this redwood in the distance. And these are also hazards. As Fred mentioned in the intro, sometimes these are hidden. There's still earth over the top of them, soil on the top, and you can step on those. If it's right after the fire, they can be really superheated, and actually the roots would still be burning. So be very cautious as you're kind of surveying your property for the first time and within a few months after the fire. So the last we look at is canopy torching. And for redwoods and hardwoods, canopy torching is not a really good estimate of mortality. There can be a lot of damage to the canopy, and foliage is expendable, right? A lot of these deciduous species will drop it, even evergreen species regenerate. So this typically isn't a good metric. You look at these two photos of an oak woodland and a redwood forest mixed with other conifers, and it looks pretty dramatic, but really that's not a good sign indication of how the fire severity or how damaged those trees are. That is, canopy damage though is very true for looking at conifers. So the saying is red is dead. So if you see a Douglas fir that has even a small amount of dead tissue, it's very likely that that tree will have issues. Either it's already dying or it's more susceptible to other things that we'll talk about in a minute. And I just want to remind everyone that when you look at these trees, it can be fairly dramatic, and it looks like everything could be dead. But if there's any portion, it could be a 1-inch strip of cambium still alive. Redwoods and oaks have this incredible capacity to resprout through epicormic sprouts. And so you can see these redwoods within a few months of the fire are already producing what we call this bottle brushing. And these oaks are 1 year after the Mendocino complex fire. And they have both basal sprouts and epicormic sprouts. And this is a moderately burned stand, moderate severity stand. And when that above ground biomass mortality is killed, it doesn't mean the tree is dead. Remember, it still has the resources and the roots. These are except for conifers. Remember, this is our hardwoods and our redwoods, our native hardwoods and redwoods. And they have this, again, this incredible capacity to regenerate through sprouting. So it could be rather dramatic, but the system starts to recover. This is within a month or so of the Wallbridge fire. So the systems recover pretty quickly. The other thing you have to look at is insects and diseases. So insects and diseases are really important natural disturbances in forest health. They begin the process of recycling nutrients, and they're going to be really important, and there's nothing you can do about them coming into your stands once trees are stressed. However, fortunately for us, our hardwoods and our redwoods are relatively resistant to insects and diseases, especially the living tissue. So here you have a half-dead oak. The dead side is infested with beetles. The living side is not. Conifers, the other conifers, not so much. And the issues with that is these are beetles that are specifically feeding on dead trees, but some of those species can cross into stressed living trees. And if the populations build up, they can get into your healthy trees that weren't even damaged by the fire. So it's something to be conscious of when you're thinking about forest restoration, forest management, is the persistent issues with insects and diseases spreading from fire stressed trees into your healthy trees. You're also gonna have to look at issues in your regeneration, such as sooty mold and other kinds of organisms that might be infesting your regeneration. And then deer browse or wildlife browse can be a pretty significant issue in regeneration. The sprouts and sometimes in the late summer, fall are the only source of food, and they can be hit pretty hard. But again, these trees have an amazing capacity to regenerate after this damage. So I just want to sum this up and think about, well, how do, it can be daunting to kind of look across the landscape and figure out what am I going to do, what am I going to focus on. And really one of the first things we want to look at is hazard trees and decide what trees are high risk. And it's not realistic to do that across the entire landscape. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on our defensible space, our right-of-way, and our high-use areas. And those are the places where we're going to do a real strong assessment. And these are some things that you can initially do on your own by looking at our trees and determining the amount of damage they have and whether or not they could potentially fail and what risks they might present. So big trees with lots of damage, little trees typically are going to become hazard trees. Trees that are stressed but still alive might be susceptible to insects and diseases. They're weakened in stress, so you have to look out for abiotic factors like wind and rain. And then maybe the damage to the tree wasn't enough to cause mortality, but it could have weakened it structurally, and that might present an issue. So these are things that we need to look out for as we're initially assessing the health of our trees. All right, so I'm going to finish up with just some management considerations. These are just kind of some BMPs or maybe some basic goals or guidelines that I'm going to recommend here. So how you manage your forest land after a fire depends entirely on your goals and objectives. What you want your system to look like, what you want your forest to look like, this is your opportunity to decide, and you can develop your goals and your objectives and your management plan to fit whatever you think is best. Pretty much every type of management activity in forested land, whether you're going to be harvesting or not, requires a registered professional forester. So one of the first things you should do is consult the registered professional forester, an RPF. So everybody should be calling Fred after this to get his advice. If you're going to salvage, if part of your objective and your goal is to manage for timber and you want to recover some of that potential timber before it's lost, you need to get that in place sooner rather than later. It needs permits and an RPF. Lots of things can factor into how well the timber sells, if it can sell at all. It'll get punky really quick, especially conifers like Doug fir. They'll become unmarketable rather quickly within a year and a half. So these are things that have to happen pretty quickly. But if your goal is not immediately to recover the cost of the potential loss of timber value, then we preach kind of this, and you might hear this more today. I know Rich talks about this too, that less is more kind of management practice, where initially let the system recover when you can, when it's allowable, right? Whether they're not hazard trees or when your goals and objectives meet this. Give the system time to recover. These trees have an amazing capacity to regenerate after fire, and areas where you thought it might have been total loss might actually be okay and recovering, but it depends entirely on what your expectations are. Things you can do on your own after a fire is map burn severity. Remember, it's highly variable across the landscape. Take the areas that you would think are the most severely damaged, and maybe those are areas where you're going to focus most of your management efforts. Assess your infrastructure. If you're going to do any management activity, you got to make sure your roads and all of your infrastructure is in place. Manage your hazards. This is a good time to revisit or develop a management plan, because you need to think about your forest restoration goals. And what are your long-term management plans? What do you want your forest to look like? How do you want it to recover? Are you going to replant? Are you going to do vegetation management? Do you have invasive species? I clicked ahead too soon. And then long-term management, right? We're not just thinking about immediately, but we're looking into the future. This is the time where you have the opportunity, you have a clean slate, and this is the opportunity in which you can, we always finish by saying, build it back better. You want to develop your management plan and your long-term goals to create a more resilient and healthy forest than, potentially what you could have been starting with, or what maybe you were trying to get there, but this fire interrupted that system. And one really good way to do this is photo points. And so a really cool way that you can, put in data and do all that effort, but one really cool way is to just put in some photo points and see if the management work you did, or if you're letting it naturally regenerate, see if the system is recovering the way you had expected to, and if you need to adjust your plan. So that's what I have. This is my contact information. You can reach me by email or at the phone number. I have a lot of these resources compiled or assembled on my website. I will post this link in the chat box. And then I highly recommend that, regardless of what your objectives are, that you contact an RPF for their professional advice and technical help. So thank you for your time. I don't know if I have time for questions.
Yes, so we are going to move into questions for Michael, but before we do, I'm going to launch a 1-question quiz to our whole group just to see if you were paying attention. So give me 1 second here. All right, here we go. Give us all a minute to answer this. Give your best
I'll
guess.
answer some of the questions in the chat box while y'all are doing this. So one question was, what are native hardwoods that are fire embracing? Well, I mean, pretty much every native hardwood is. Think about every hardwood that you've seen. Does it resprout after fire, or after it's been cut, or some kind of management activity has been done to it? If it resprouts vigorously after, some kind of disturbance, it's embracing. It's an embracing strategy. So manzanita, chaparral, and these manzanita shrublands are extremely fire embracing, right? That is, they've evolved to essentially burn really hot and regenerate because of the disturbance, and regenerate in these really kind of perfectly conditioned sites.
Okay, I have 20, let's see, about 2/3 of everyone has voted. And I'm just going to give everyone 10 seconds more to get in your answer. Okay. All right, so which symptom of burn damage is not a good predictor of redwood mortality? We had a lot of respondents say crown torching, but Michael, what's the right answer?
The right answer. Good job, everybody.
Right, great. Okay, so now if there are any other questions for Michael? Okay, so it seems like there are none at this time, but we are going to have kind of an extended Q&A at the very end of the workshop. So if you have, if some questions come up, feel free to ask him then. He'll be sticking around. Okay, thanks.
All right, well, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, and our next presenter is Rich Cassell. And I want to let all the presenters know there is a slight delay from slide to slide. So as you advance to your next slide, it takes everyone else a second to see your slide, just so you know. So you might want to take a pause before speaking about your next slide.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Rich Cassell. I'm a post-fire restoration specialist. I'm also a certified professional erosion and sediment control specialist. I worked for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service for 43 years, and then retired 4 years ago And in those 4 years, California was on fire. So the agency hired me back as a contractor, post-fire restoration specialist, every year since I retired, including this year, currently working on the CZU fire in Santa Cruz County, which burned about 85,000 acres, meeting with private property owners and rural landowners with fire damage. In the 2017 wine country fires, I spent 2 months up in Sonoma and Napa County assisting property owners. And then last year, the Kincaid fire in Sonoma County, spent a couple of months as well, working with natural resource agencies, community groups, and again, working individually on private lands, providing post-fire restoration advice on the post-fire landscape. So my presentation is, we're going to be talking about erosion issues following wildfire, and not just the first winter, but second and third winters following fire. So I've entitled my show as Post-Fire Restoration, What Works and What's a Waste of Time. The overview, very briefly talking about safety hazards, role of nature and wildlife recovery, post-fire assessment, post-fire restoration strategies, the waste of time practices, and then I'll sum things up with my top 10. So safety first, always, the potential safety hazards that exist in the post-fire landscape, whether it's in urban areas or rural wildland areas. There are fire damaged trees. I work every day right now, and I'm hearing trees fall and large branches fall. I never enter anyone's property without a hard hat. The toxic ash, even with the best ventilation, and mouth protection, I still end up with headaches every day. Not so much on the wildland ash, but certainly around burning structures. There's unstable slopes. There's the potential for debris flows in particularly the first winter following fire, but that can continue for several years. Rockfall is a danger, and a lot of people don't think about rocks falling and sliding down the slopes, but even in assessing properties, have to be very careful. And this is even before any rainfall. Sinkholes and areas, it's already been discussed, when the fire burns beneath the ground surface and burns root systems. But there may be other hazards that the ground is not safe. So you have to be very careful. Utility hazards, particularly immediately following fire damage, there still could be live wires on the ground. Road washouts, burned out culverts, just trying to get to some sites. Sometimes you just can't, use your GPS or your other mapping devices to get to properties, because you kind of have to go around after fire. And another thing is a lot of displaced wildlife out there, and they're scared, and they actually can be dangerous. There's even displaced domestic animals, horses and cattle. So be watchful for all of those things, whether you're a property owner or that you're someone that's assessing fire damages. And flood and stream bank erosion is usually an issue following fire as well. So that's something that you probably will see not only in the first year following fire, but for years to come. So some overarching concepts to think about before deciding what to do, if anything, on your landscape. You first and foremost need to consider nature as your first and best post-fire restoration practice. Understanding natural processes and the role they play in wildlife recovery. I can't emphasize this point enough. I know people are anxious to do something and get things and get their lives back on order and throw everything but the kitchen sink at their burned landscape. But in many cases, you may just be making a situation worse and slowing down nature's response. So understanding those natural processes, that first and foremost, fire is very natural in the landscape. Soil erosion is natural and a land forming process. It goes on after fire, but it goes on all the time. So as a soil erosion control specialist, I can say that I recognize that, and I recognize that we can't control all erosion, but we need to be aware of it, and it does have a role in the land forming process. And many plants actually depend on fire to regenerate. So knowing that role is important before you are too quick to start cutting things down or planting new trees or plants. We need to wait a little bit on nature here. Some plants and grasslands are actually stimulated by fire, so there may be very little need to do any kind of reseeding or replanting. I tell most folks to wait until at least spring before they really fully assess what really needs to be done in terms of restoring the plant communities. Obviously, where the fire is burned in lower intensities, the damages to plant material and root systems and seed bank is a lot less than where the fire burned extremely hot. So some of the other things to understand about nature following fire is generally in the lower and the moderately burned areas, there's a lot of smoke damage and heat damage to plants that results in a lot of burned leaves that end up dropping to the ground and covering the soil and providing a natural mulch. There's very little, if any, need to do any more than what nature is doing. But I see over and over again people applying erosion control practices, fabrics and jute netting and thick mulch layers on top of leaf drop, or leaf drop goes on top of that. And it's way more than is necessary. It really slows down regeneration, may even prevent, seed regermination from native seed bank that's already in the soil. The burned plants themselves, they still have root systems holding soil particles together, the ground together. The plant parts are impeding the impact of direct rainfall on the soil. So they play a role to still provide erosion in soil and slope protection. Fire-related debris that might be in streams can also be beneficial. I'm not that quick to tell people to, clean out their streams and channels from debris that has fallen in from burned trees or plants. That these things can actually help to slow velocities or hold debris back further up in the watershed instead of bringing everything down to the bridges and culverts and what have you. So working with nature means to be working with the natural flow of water over the landscape. We have a tendency to control too much water in the landscape. And every time we think about runoff and rainfall, we think about what can we do with it and how can we move it to get it out of our way. But oftentimes when we think of the water sheet flowing over the landscape more slowly and gently and over a larger area, there's more opportunities for it to seep into the soil and cause less problems. So some of the basic soil erosion factors to keep in the back of your mind is that vegetation plays a role, the type of soil. So knowing the type of soil that you have, sandier soils generally have a higher soil erosion hazard, whereas clayer soil types have a lesser soil erosion factor. The steepness of slope, but also the length of the slope, how long the slope is. So that has to do with the volume of runoff and the speed of runoff, particularly on the post-fire landscape where vegetation has been, compromised. And then not just the rainfall amount, but as important, if not more important, is the intensity of rainfall, particularly when we start talking about debris flows and mudslides and mud flows and those sorts of things. It's usually the intensity that breaks that camel's back, you know. And then the human impact. Our impact on the landscape is almost the biggest impact on the erosion factor. So if we're involved and understand all the natural processes and lessen our human impact, we can have a much better chance of preventing erosion on the post-fire landscape. So understanding some of the impacts, you know, wildfire can affect soil health. It can increase erosion hazard. It can increase slope instability. It can increase runoff. It can affect both air and water quality, plant communities, fish and wildlife habitat, and obviously people's homes, businesses, and their lives. So high intensity fires can burn hotter and they can destroy more completely plants and roots and resident seed banks. So plant regeneration is going to be much slower. On higher intensity burns, there may be a need to help nature out. I'm not saying that do nothing in these situations, but in the lower intensity fires, typically the fire is burning cooler, but can smolder and still have a severe impact on soil and root systems. So it's very important to know that each site has its own specific set of variables, and no sites are identical. Therefore, there's no one solution for every site. In fact, one size does not, fit all when it comes to erosion control following wildfire. So these are some of the things that we assess when I go out to look at a property, but something that property owners can assess themselves. How long has it been since this landscape has burned? What the site history is? How hot did the fire burn? And what was the severity of the burn? The degree of damage from any firefighting effort. And in many cases, I spend a lot of time just with the firefighting effort damage and hardly any time doing anything else, because this is where I expect that we might see issues with the diversion of water, the concentration of water, and issues related to higher fire hazard, where there's been a lot of disturbance from dozer activity and the firefighting. The presence of white ash usually indicates where a fire has burned extremely hot, and typically damage to root systems and to plant materials and to seed bank is going to be more evident in areas where there's white ash. Then we look at the overall degree of plant and tree loss, the damage to infrastructure and excess roots, and the impact to soil and slopes. So some of the overarching strategies, what to do, if anything, as I mentioned earlier, doing nothing, but doing nothing is nothing more than using nature as the best management practice. Doing no widespread seeding. Now there's a possible exception of maybe some range and pasture lands where we can do some improved pastures following fire. There may be an exception in areas, homes that had burned in neighborhoods and around home sites after debris removal has taken place, and you have bare and disturbed soils in a very, site-specific, more isolated area. But no really wildland seeding is being recommended. In many ways, it actually would slow down regeneration instead of helping it. So mulching natural leaf drop, let's work with that first. If we don't have that, let's go to straw, weed-free straw or rice straw. Wood chips, not so much. Wood chips can actually delay and reduce regeneration unless you keep them really thin, just a couple of inches. But they also, as they break down, tie up nitrogen, and they're really slow to break down. So wood chips maybe on flat ground, but I don't see it in the post-fire landscape on slopes. Gravel's considered a mulch, and hydro is hydro mulching on difficult, steep sites, difficult to access, and probably without any seed in it. And that can be a whole talk on its own. So in different types of mulch I just mentioned, I won't go through this again, except that if you're going to do any strawing, we usually wait just before the first rains because straw can be a fire hazard. And we want to keep the depth 2 inches or less. Again, less is more. If it's too deep, we're slowing things down, and it will slow down, the rate of regeneration. I think this is going to be talked about in another presentation, but containing toxic debris and sediment around homes and structures that burned is extremely important. There's a number of different methods that can be used to do that, but it's one of the things that we assess when we meet with property owners. Fiber rolls and straw wattles, one of the most common practices used after fire, especially in the more the urban settings, but it's also one of the practices that are being installed incorrectly and mislocated, and in many cases not needed at all. But they're basically filtration devices. They manage and slow runoff. They can control erosion by doing so, controlling sediment and toxins, but proper location and insulation is critical. Just what you see in this picture. This is on a lawn. It really didn't even need one straw wattle. This property owner paid a contractor $5,000 just to put that in. So a lot of people are being taken advantage of, unfortunately, following fire, and you just need to be aware. So minimizing tree cutting and plant removal, waiting till spring, waiting a year or more in some cases. Let's see what's really dead before we start tearing things out. But more importantly, the disturbance to the soil and the slopes is tremendous when you go in there and you try to make everything look pretty and cut things. But a lot of things are being cut that aren't dead. Correcting drainage issues. Remember that everything is undersized after fire. Many cases, many things were undersized before fire. But assessing drainage systems is one of your top priorities. They need to not only be repaired, but they may need to be enlarged. You may need to create a backup system for them. You may need to create new systems or possibly eliminate or relocate existing systems. So drainage. So repairing damage from the firefighting effort. We mentioned that earlier, but this is an example of a lot of churned up soil from dozer activity, and the installation of a water bar done almost up and down the slope, which is actually going to make this situation worse, not better. Flop and scatter is a treatment for fire breaks, dozer areas, and loose soil where you can use the plant material, the burned plant material, and make your own erosion control blanket. Better to use it in this form than in chipping. You generally want to keep it below the kneecap. This picture is a little dense here, but I like to see it a lot thinner. Seeding and revegetation, like I said, we don't really recommend it. It's very site specific. We want to wait on nature. This is a picture following the wine country fires of rangeland and the foothills in the Sonoma Valley area, 2 weeks following the first rain and about 6 weeks after the fire was put out. So very quick. We're going to want to address invasive plants following fire. They're very quick to come back in. So notice that. But I also tell folks, you had invasive plants before. Any plant is a good plant going into winter. But non-natives can delay natural recovery. So it's kind of a site-specific call, but in some cases you may need to wait till spring, but where you're not going to be causing a lot of unnecessary disturbances, you might be able to get some of those non-natives out of there sooner rather than later. So monitoring maintenance is going to be essential for all practices, and probably after every storm event, and to repair any defects as soon as possible. Some of the practices that might be a waste of time would absolutely no jute netting, no erosion control blankets. Sandbags, there's a place for them, but sometimes there's just too many. Plastic sheeting, absolutely not. Straw wattles, like I said, there's a place for them, but I see most of them being installed incorrectly or not placed properly. There's a place for hydromulching, but it just shouldn't be, everywhere. And seeding is site specific. This picture in this photo, they cut all of the vegetation off the landscape. Nothing really needed to have to be done here. It didn't burn that hot. You can see what's in the background. Some people put plastic on the slopes. This property owner paid almost $20,000 to have this project installed on their landscape, and it's all wrong. The jute netting's wrong. The netting, the wattles are wrong. There's nothing right about what they did here. So it's very unfortunate. Emergency practices need to be used with extreme caution or not at all. They oftentimes just provide a false sense of security, and in many cases are installed improperly as well. So to end with my top 10 list, top 10, get help. Licensed experts, NRCS and resource conservation districts is a source of free assistance, free technical assistance, non-vested in interest. Number 9, to respect those laws of nature. When you control water, you control nature, and that almost never ends well. Keep that in the back of your mind. One size does not fit all. Every property is unique, and that's why a site-specific assessment is so important, or at least for you to assess with the knowledge that you're gaining from this workshop. Minimize soil and slope plant disturbances. Remember, there's no urgency to remove burned trees or plants. You need to look beyond property lines and work with neighbors. Just like fire, tall trees, runoff, erosion, sliding issues don't respect property lines. And when we put projects and restoration practices on the landscape, we can't sometimes just end them at the property line. So working with neighbors can be essential. Protecting property access. All road drainage facilities, remember, are undersized after fire and going to need a lot more maintenance. Emergency measures are very high risk and can provide a false sense of security. Sometimes doing nothing at all is better. Practices need maintenance and monitoring and maintenance after every storm. Do nothing or doing less may be best. And consider nature as your best management practice. At the end of the day, there's no silver bullet. When it's not safe, it's not safe. Always have an emergency plan and multiple exit routes from your property. And sorry, I might have run over a couple of minutes, but and I can wait until the end for questions if we want to get back on schedule. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich. That was awesome. We are a few minutes over, and I'll just launch our poll right now. And maybe as people are responding to the poll, you can answer a few other questions. Someone asked in the chat, Rich, how do you assess hydrophobic soils in high severity burn areas?
You just scrape away a little bit of ash, if there's still ash on the soil, and drop a few drops of water on the soil. If it beads up and it stays beaded up for a minute or more, it has some level of hydrophobic characteristic. If it stays for 5 minutes or more, it's very, very high hydrophobic conditions. Now, if you don't get it in the upper inch, go down 2 inches, go down 3 inches. You could go down to 6 inches, and you sometimes that hydrophobic layer is not close to the surface. It may be several inches below the surface. So if you don't have it in the first couple of inches, doesn't mean that you don't have it. Go further down and test it with a few drops of water. It should bead up just like it was on wax paper. But so, most soils have a little bit of that in them anyway, this water repellency. That's why you want to wait, more than a few seconds. It may stand there for 10 or 15 seconds is almost normal, but if it sits there for a half a minute, then it's starting to become hydrophobic. Any longer than that, then you can gauge on how much it's hydrophobic. So that should help.
Great, thank you. I am going to read off our results from the poll. So we had about 20 respondents, and the majority of them said the first and best post-wildfire restoration practice is to wait on and work with nature, minimize disturbance to burn slopes, soils, trees, and other plants. And I know from Rich's presentation that is correct. So there are a lot of other, there are practices that you can take, such as enlarging your drainage. I know that was another one that got quite a few votes because Rich did make a point that drainage is important. Everything is undersized once the fire has happened. But really, Rich was saying the first thing is to kind of take the less is more approach. So great. Thank you, Rich.
Yeah, thank you. Very good. Very good, everyone. You were paying attention.
Yes. All right, so our next presenter is Carolyn Whitesell.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to present today. And I'm going to be going over understanding wildlife concerns. I'm a human wildlife interactions advisor at UC Cooperative Extension. Okay. So first off, when we think about fire and wildlife, I feel like people's first reactions are wondering, what happens to the animals that are living in these areas? And of course, we have the direct impacts, right, for the individuals whose home ranges are within the fire. So who can escape? And of course, this is going to vary. As an ecologist, we always love to say it depends. And I think growing off of the previous two presentations, that certainly is the case with this as well. It's really going to depend on the severity of the fire, the patchiness of the fire, how quickly the fire is moving, and how large the fire is. But generally, larger mammals like deer, mountain lions, coyotes will be able to move quickly and will oftentimes be able to outrun the fire. Of course, birds will be able to fly away if, again, depending upon size. Smaller herps like frogs, toads, snakes, they'll often take shelter underneath a boulder or a log. And again, depending upon the severity of the fire, they may be fine. That may be enough protection for them. Of course, you're going to have some individuals that aren't fully able to escape. Smokey the Bear being perhaps the most famous. In the most recent California fires, you may have heard about the 3 mountain lion cubs that were rescued. There are also other instances of an adult mountain lion and adult bears being found with severely burned paws. So they were able to escape the flames, but suffered injuries from it. And for individuals like that, there actually is a new network called a Wildlife Disaster Network that's been created in collaboration with CDFW and UC Davis Vet School. And so for some of those animals, they actually were able to capture them, rehabilitate them, and release them. So that was, heartwarming story of the mountain lion that had the burned paws, and they treated her actually with fish skin, really interesting, the innovations in burn treatments, and she's now back in her territory. So again, it will vary, but I think optimistically, or I like to know, actually, the more I research this, most animals are able to get out. And there were amazing stories of deer and elk that actually wait out a fire, in the middle of a pond or in a river, and they're just able to hunker down until the fire passes. All right. And perhaps another great study that was really able to give concrete data on this has been on mountain lions, where down in the Santa Monica Mountains a few years ago for the Woolsey fire, the National Park Service actually had 13 mountain lions collared at the time of the fire. So they were able to see directly what did these mountain lions do. And 11 of them were completely fine. They were able to escape the flames, weren't negatively impacted. One did perish in the fire, and one did die as a result of burns. And so I think that's, part of this drive to try, whenever possible, to rehabilitate some of those animals that have suffered burns. But also when I was chatting with some colleagues who were studying deer, and so also had collared deer a few years ago during a fire in Mendocino County, they were amazed that just hours after the fire went through the deer territories. The deer left their territory, escaped the flames. 2-3 hours later, they went right back. And so again, depending upon how severe the fire was and how large, it is quite patchy. So the animals oftentimes are able to go right back to where they were before and still able to survive in that landscape. Of course, there are going to be a lot of indirect impacts having to do with impacts on habitat. And this is where different species are going to react quite differently. You have some species that really require this habitat heterogeneity and require this regrowth of vegetation and are going to flourish after fires. So, mule deer love going into burned areas. Deer often their numbers will increase in a few years after a fire because of all of that regrowth of vegetation provides so much nutrition for them. It's also much more open habitat. So they're potentially able to escape predation easier because there isn't as much cover for mountain lions to hunt them. But then when you have the increased deer numbers, that then, you have the impact later of increased mountain lion numbers. So in some ways, fires can be really great for wildlife. And when we think about wildfire and wildlife is a big tongue twister for me. When you think about wildfire, it's really important to remember in terms of conservation that we're focusing on populations. And so while it's incredibly tragic when you lose individuals because of the fire, overall, these populations and these species are fire adapted. And so, they've evolved to survive with fire on the landscape. And so they will be able to recover and in some cases really require fire in order to flourish. And in some instances, fire itself can actually provide a hunting opportunity. So there's some really interesting accounts, often from firefighters, where they've seen, bears and raccoons, when it's a slow moving fire, they'll actually be walking right just a few feet from the edge of the fire. And what they're doing is all of the snakes or the rodents that are escaping the flames, the bears and raccoons are right there to catch them. Same with birds of prey, where they'll come to where there is fire. And again, be able to go after the rodents that are running in the open, trying to get out, and the insects that are flying, trying to escape the flames. The birds will use that purposefully as a way to hunt, which is, I think, fascinating. Now, a really common question, I'm sure you've seen this circulating on social media whenever there's a big fire, is should I be putting out food or water for wildlife? And the answer, on CDFW, different wildlife organizations, is no. You actually shouldn't. And I know it's really hard because you see these animals that are tired, they've been escaping from the flames. You want to help them. I totally get that. It's heart-wrenching sometimes when you see these animals that are looking hungry and are looking thirsty. But there's a whole host of why it's best to let nature take its course and encourage them to keep moving to find natural sources of water and food. So because this can be so heart-wrenching, I just really want to go over the reasons why we don't encourage people to actively be putting out buckets of water or actively putting out food for wildlife right after a fire. So first off, in terms of feeding, remember that it is illegal to feed wildlife in the state of California. So non-starter for that. In terms of putting out water, again, you don't want to be artificially encouraging congregation in areas with food or water handouts. You may be artificially supporting a population of animals that the habitat's not going to be able to support on its own. And that can have a whole host of ecological negative impacts down the road. You're also potentially going to be increasing disease risk if you're encouraging the congregation of animals. In California, very recently, we've had adenovirus outbreaks. There's also a parasite that attacks pigeons, and these are spread right where animals or birds are congregating, often at water sources. And think about it, with a fire, you're going to be having animals coming from all over, from all these different territories that have potentially been pushed onto your property. And so because they're coming from such a large area, potentially, there's a much higher risk of being able to spread disease. So again, you don't want to really cluster the animals together. You may be incidentally altering ecological roles. Again, you want them to keep moving. You don't want to support like more deer, let's say, than the habitat can actually support at the time post-fire. Also, you may inadvertently be drawing animals closer to roads or across them. So if your property is near, let's say, a busy county road where people, sometimes go fast, if you put out water there and there normally isn't water there, you can be attracting animals to your property that typically would just pass through. And if they're going to be staying close to your property, trying to access that water all the time, you can be increasing their odds of being on the road. And roadkill is a really big problem. I mean, especially for mountain lions, it's one of the highest causes of mortality in California. So you really don't want to be encouraging animals to be near roads. You may also be fostering boldness. And this is something we've learned, I think, well, often from coyotes, where if you accidentally foster boldness, it can lead towards aggression towards people. And so, and certainly in Southern California, most of the instances where coyotes have bit people, when they then go in and investigate to learn a little bit more about this particular coyote or the local situation, more times than not, they find out that the coyote has been accessing food in the neighborhood. And so someone's been feeding it. And I don't mean like hand feeding it. I mean, putting out cat food or having trash out that the coyote is getting. And when animals like coyotes start to associate people with food, even if it's just, on your porch or on your property, it leads to them losing their fear of people. And that in turn can cause aggression, which, you may be setting up this animal to come into conflict with people, which I know is the last thing you're trying to do because you're just trying to help them. But you may accidentally be making things worse. And lastly, or second to last, you may be fostering non-natives like feral cats or black rats, where again, try to just, I know it's really hard, but just trying to sit back and let nature take its course can be the best action. And lastly, because this is certainly more of my area of expertise, is you may accidentally, by putting out food or water, increase the potential for human-wildlife conflict. Again, if you're attracting animals to stay on your property, even if you don't have pets or livestock that could be at risk, maybe your neighbors do. And certainly with fires, you have the potential where, even if, let's say you have never seen a mountain lion on your property, well, mountain lions may have been forced into your area as a result of the fire. And even if you just had one mountain lion before, maybe now you're going to have multiple. There are plenty of stories of mountain lions getting pushed out and, being more willing to overlap with neighboring territories because they, for whatever reason, realize that they're going to have to do that until they can go back into their territories when that vegetation has resprouted. So I really encourage you, regardless of fire or not, but especially post-fire, when you have the potential for new individuals coming onto your property, you have the potential for more conflict. And so, things you can do to protect your livestock and pets. And of course, I encourage this pre and post-fire, but again, really important when you've had a fire in your area. Golden standard is going to be enclosing your animals in at night, ideally with the roof. That's going to be the safest bet. In addition to that, having appropriate fencing. So, I'm happy to talk to you further about what kind of fencing can be most effective for, let's say, coyotes or other species. There's fox lights, which can be, motion activated. Do a bright light at night. You can also get motion activated machines that'll play a loud noise to try to spook off predators that may be checking out your animals. And, a much more permanent situation, but something that, you may want to think about, be a livestock guardian animal. And again, I'm happy to chat further either tonight or I'll put up my email to talk more about these options. But I hope, besides, I'm sorry to like be telling people not that they shouldn't be putting out food and water, but I hope that knowing that actually most individual animals are able to escape safely will, add some hope and optimism. And even, as previous speakers have said, even if it looks really bleak after a fire, life can come back really quickly, and so can the wildlife. So thank you so much. Feel free to contact me. Yeah, hope you learned something.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was awesome. And that is really encouraging to know that most animals are able to escape a wildfire situation. So I'm going to launch our poll question now. True or false, slow-moving ground fires can provide hunting opportunities for some wildlife species. Give everyone a minute to cast their vote. Meanwhile, we have some questions for you, Carolyn. Someone asked what fox lights are.
Yeah, so I will put up a link to the product. And there's also something called gadflies. So they're a predator deterrent. So it'll flash a really bright light, and it can be to look in terms of how you can program it, but it'll be like intermittent. And oftentimes that will be enough to scare animals off. And then gadflies, I'll have to find, it'll take me a second. We've tested this out where it is motion activated and plays a terrible noise. And we've sample size of 1, we've only had 1 opportunity to test it with the mountain lion coming after some goats, but it was highly effective. Mountain lion did not come back. So I'll post that next. And then I saw someone asking about possible impacts to rabbit populations. So rabbits and rodents, they typically are not fast enough to escape fires. So there may be a delay to wait for neighboring populations to immigrate in and recolonize burned areas. But as you know, rabbits reproduce very quickly. It's just a matter of, they don't travel huge distances. So it may take some time to see them coming back, but they will.
Okay. All right. Okay, results are in. 100% of our respondents said that it is true that ground fires can provide hunting opportunities for some wildlife. So good job, everyone. Okay, I'm going to end the polling and invite on our next speaker, Ms. Stephanie Larson. All right, Stephanie, you are muted. Go ahead and start.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate everybody hanging in there tonight, spending their Thursday with us to kind of help work through some of the issues that you're dealing with as far as managing your vegetation, after a wildfire, whether it's forest or rangelands or just kind of some grasslands that you want to be interested in. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about weed management after wildfires. And we're thinking about with weeds and disturbance. So obviously when we see weeds, they usually pop up in areas that might have been disturbed. Maybe you move some soil, you had a fire. And so you've had some disturbance, and that's when the weeds tend to come up, because it increases the resource availability, meaning there's not a lot of competition. So there's not other plants that are competing for water and sunlight. And also that the ash that as a result of the fire actually kind of feeds the soil if it wasn't too severe of a fire. And so that provides this high resource availability for weeds. And as I'll talk about in a bit, there's also a lot of seeds that are sitting in the soil that have been waiting to germinate, and this disturbance gives them that opportunity to germinate. So it's not that the weeds just miraculously appeared. They've always been there and lying in wait, but because of your good management, they didn't express themselves, they weren't able to germinate, and other good grasses and plants were helping outcompete those weeds. And so weeds will increase after a disturbance in this way and a fire. So I want to kind of think, have you just kind of mentally, if you had a fire and you lost a lot of vegetation, just to kind of refresh your memory on what noxious weeds might have been there in the area pre-fire, and maybe you were pretty good about controlling them. I think we're all pretty familiar with yellow star or Medusa head, but I'm also starting to see some increases of Klamath weed, the distaff thistle, gorse. We see a lot of gorse on the coast, the varieties of the brooms, the French and the Spanish, the tree of heaven, a stinkwort, and the barb goatgrass is starting to come into some of the areas, especially around the Walbridge fire. So yellow star thistle responds to a fire disturbance. It germinates in the first rain. So if we ever get another rain, the yellow star thistle will be germinating. And as it comes up in the rosette stages, it looks like a dandelion in the winter, and it's an annual, and it comes back from seeds. And so it is a summer annual, which means it goes to flower in the summer. So when everything else is dried up, yellow star has a deep taproot, and so it goes way down into the soil profile to grab whatever soil moisture it can get, and that allows it to grow in the summer. So yellow star thistle is one of those that's going to come back. Medusa head. I don't know if many of you know what Medusa head looks like, but it does look like, think about the mythical Medusa and her snakes out of her head, and that's kind of where they got that name. And it does respond to fire, and it germinates in the first fall rains, just like now. It has this very unique blue-green color, and it is also an annual, which means it's coming back from the seeds as well. So that one is you're going to see in the late spring into the summer. That would be the only green thing left. And you think, oh, I still have grasses, but no grazing animal wants to eat Medusa head. Klamath weed also responds to a fire. It has a bright yellow flower. The problem is it's toxic to livestock, and it's kind of a novel plant that's been moving in after fires, and I'm seeing it a lot in the forest and stuff. And it's a perennial, and it reproduces by creeping stems and by seeds. So it does both. So it's a little bit harder to control. Smooth distaff thistle. We've had distaff around for a while, and it's going to respond to a disturbance. It really takes over areas that are bare ground and doesn't have a lot of competition. We see this a lot in Marin County. It has these really bright yellow flowers, spiny throughout, and it's an annual, so it's producing from seeds. But it really takes over an area that it's lacking in vegetation and competition. So I know a lot of you are interested in the brooms. There's Spanish, French, and Scotch broom, and it's going to respond to a fire, and it's going to form dense, impenetrable thickets. So it becomes a real problem. And I've seen this take over very quickly after all the fires that we've had. And it's a shrub that reproduces by seeds. And it has a lot of seeds. So it's something that if you remember you had it and you were controlling it, well, it's going to come back with a vengeance. So you might want to start thinking about, okay, where did I see that? The tree of heaven is, it responds to disturbance, and it forms these dense stands, and it grows very high, up to 70 feet. And it's a tree, so it reproduces by underground stems and by seeds. And so it's something that's been coming in as kind of an issue, and especially for the vineyards. It might house some of the vectors that are affecting some of the vines. And so tree of heaven has become one of those of concern for folks. Stinkwort, it's one that you see in driveways, in roadways, areas that definitely have no vegetation whatsoever. It's very responsive to disturbance. So if you see that, it forms these dense plants up to 3 feet wide. It's tall, and it's also going to persist from seeds. The barb goatgrass, this one is very noxious. It responds to fire. Nothing wants to eat that. It germinates with the fall rains now, and it matures in the late season, so July through August. And it's an annual, And the problem with this is it has different sets of seeds. And so you might think you might get some of the seeds, but there'll be some others waiting in the wings to germinate. And so barb grass is one of those that you want to also be aware of. So if you can kind of, put your mind and say, okay, these were some of the issues I had. Maybe I had a plan and a ranch plan or a grazing plan or a forest management plan. And these were some of the weeds I wanted to be concerned about. Maybe you mapped them out. Maybe you didn't. And so now it's post-fire assessment. And so it's time to start thinking about what might I do to reduce the impacts of any weeds that are going to come into my property. So, and I know Mike Jones talked about this, is a weed, a kind of a plan, having some kind of forest management plan, and maybe you can also add a burned area weed management plan. So hopefully maybe you knew what the weedy species present prior to the fire, maybe not. So it's time to become familiar with other potential weed invaders. So they're present, they were always there, they were hiding in the wings, like I said, they have lots of seeds in the soil, but they were dormant. So maybe you didn't get fire burned through your area, but you had equipment. So maybe dozers or CAL FIRE came through and cut fire lines. Well, that's a disturbance. And so, and then you've got a lot of trucks going in and out because maybe you did have some fire damage. And so you've had some fire crews or some, tree fallers in there, and maybe their seeds are being collected and they're passing them in from, place to place. So you want to think about that. And then as Rich talked about, the use of wattles, and maybe through soil erosion efforts that they might have gotten in, the seeds might be contaminated in that straw. And so you want to think about, where's my sources of my erosion control methods, where are my crews been? Do I have a plan to ask them to clean their tires before they come onto my property? I mean, just start thinking about how I can prevent additional problems that I have to deal with down the road when it involves weed management. So what I want to think about is this early detection and rapid response. And I know that you've got, if you had a fire, you had a whole bunch of other things you want to worry about. You're worrying about your trees, but it's also, you want to just kind of be thinking about looking at plants as they come up this spring. I know that plant doesn't look familiar to me. There's a whole lot of these plants, get them identified. Let's figure out what the best management plan for are, but we need to know what they are first. We can replant, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so you want to make sure, if I'm going to plant, what the seed mixes are, what the control method, erosion control materials are, clean the equipment before entering, survey for new weeds, treat weeds utilizing all the tools. And as I can tell you right now, this is not the time of year to control the weeds, because we haven't had any significant rains. Nothing is growing, but they're there. They're lying in wait. There's a whole lot of seeds ready to germinate once we get those rains, which are coming soon. So improving rangelands or forest lands after a fire. So you've had a fire and a lot of times people are like, I want to reseed. I lost my grass. I should reseed. And I think Rich talked about it too. It's like, do you really need to reseed? Because sometimes this is the best thing for rangelands, is that fire. If it wasn't too severe, it's going to respond. It likes fire. It evolved from fire. And so it's okay, but maybe it's an opportunity for you to say, well, I want to change the species that I had. Maybe I want to add some additional natives to my rangelands, to my mix. And so think about that. So, but in many cases, you don't need to seed. However, the weed control is very important. So before you start seeding, you want to think about like a whole calendar year of what your management plan might be, because you don't want to seed and then implement some practice to control weeds that might kill the new germinating seeds that you just planted. So you really want to have a thoughtful process of, looking at your area, start to thinking about what my goals and my objectives are, and how can I implement that into my overall management plan for controlling weeds. So it's good to know the weed life cycle, and I'm sure we all do. And annuals, obviously, they're coming from seeds. So first and foremost, to control any kind of weeds is to know what type it is. Is it an annual? Does it come from seeds? Is it going to germinate in winter? with the fall rain, or the fall and winter rains? Is it a biennial, which means that it takes 2 years, 2 growing seasons to complete its life cycle, flowering and fruiting in its second year? So you might think, well, I didn't have any weeds this first year. And then the second year, you've got a whole crop of, say, purple star thistle, because it's a biennial that's going to take 2 years. And then the last one is obviously our favorite, the perennial, which are great when you want to grow perennial desired species. But a perennial weed is one that's tended to be a lot harder to control, because it can come back from the roots or from seeds. So you have to know exactly what weed it is and what the life cycle is. And so, like I said, you've got these annual weeds that are, they sprout, they grow, they flower, and they die. And how you decide what treatments to implement to help control them, it really helps to know what life cycle is. And so thinking about that, you use different methods at different times. So that's where we always want to know what the weed is, if it's annual, perennial, and then we could start to apply some of the practices in a very successful way. Again, the perennials, they're going to do the same thing. They're going to start a little slower. The annuals, their whole reason for life is to germinate and reproduce and die. Whereas a perennial is a little more kicked back. So they're a little slower growing. So they're going to come up a little slower. They're going to come with the rains, but they're not as aggressive as the annuals. They're going to take their time to mature, and then they'll die back, and then they'll overwinter. So we have a lot of perennials that can survive without, they go dormant during our summer and then come back with the first rains. So thinking about that. Now, a lot of these weeds all produce from seeds. And the bad news is that there's a lot of seeds produced on some of these thistles. They're very advantageous plants. And so they produce a lot of seeds. And so the first infestation is often dependent on the seed. So the disturbance, it allows the seeds to come. There's no competition. There's no good desired species competing for the resources. And so depending on what the species are, they could vary from 700 seeds per plant to, 1 million seeds per plant. And they could last a long time in the soil. So thinking about going forward, you want to have healthy soil that helps sequester carbon and captures water and gets the desired species growing that helps outcompete these weeds. So that's the bad news. So thinking about a weed management strategy, excuse me, we want to identify the weed, its life cycle, its habitat. And then we want to integrate a pest management program that takes into account all the tools in the toolbox. You don't have to use them all, but they're all there for your use. But when and how you implement it really depends on the life cycle of those plants. So what you should do. So prior to the fire, the annual range was dominated by, let's say, Medusa head or yellow star or ripgut. So what are your options? Well, you could have burned, if those are one of the options. So the fire is going to release a lot of nutrients, and it's going to create this fertile seed bank for germination. So like I said, many of the weeds thrive after fire. So following the fire is imperative. So consider controlling the weeds this season. I've seen a lot of people, and I understand why. They're have so many other things on their mind that the weeds are the last thing. And so they let it go the first year, and that second year, there's a lot of weeds to control. Excuse me. So consider seeding with desired species this fall, but unfortunately it's too late. Grab some water. It's too late right now because it's too cold. The soil temperature is too cold, and you won't get any germination. So you want to monitor that weed pressure as we go from winter into spring, and then treat those weeds accordingly. So prior to the fire, and your range had lots of bare ground, what would you do? So you might think about, I didn't get burned, but I have some bare ground because of the fire breaks or just in general. Again, you might consider seeding with desired species. And when I say desired species, it really depends on what your goals are. If you want to seed with native species, because that's what you want to have lots of native grasses, that's great. Just knowing that you have to find the good seed source, they're going to be a little bit more expensive, and that you're going to have to manage those because you don't want to have competition beat out those native plants that you want. So prior to the fire, you had lots of brush, or maybe after the fire, you've lost the brush. So what you could do, again, the reseeding, and then you can control the regrowth of the shrubs through maybe some kind of hand removal, mastication, intensive grazing, or herbicides. So, and if you wanted to seed, which I wouldn't recommend seeding right now, but you usually can broadcast it at a rate of about 20 pounds per acre. Sometimes you want to make sure you get a good seed to soil connection, and then you want to cover it up with just about a quarter inch of soil so that the elements, the birds, can't get to the seed. But you do need that great soil to seed connection. You might be able to pull it by hand spreader. There might be a belly grinder. And some people have the use of a no-till drill, which I would, if we could get that, I highly recommend that, because that really gets the soil in the seed into the soil where it needs to be. And you don't really need to fertilizer, obviously, because you've had this fire, and that's going to provide the nutrients there for the soil. So just some methods to think about. Mechanical, you can do some mowing, you can do hand pulling, depending on obviously the scale of the infestation. But it's best when you're hand pulling, is you that are maybe gardeners or done a lot of thistle pulling before. It's best to do when the plants are small. And if you identify the plant and then it's an annual, you don't have to get the entire plant. So some of these, like yellow star thistle, people will mow them. And because of that taproot, they don't play fair and they can regrow. And so if you're going to hand grub or hand pull, you want to get like about an inch below the soil and get as much as that taproot, but you don't need the full taproot. It's most effective on the annuals or the perennials that don't spread by rhizomes. And it is inexpensive, except unless you have a lot of area to hand pull. And then there's like a lots of different tools that really kind of gets those woody species out to help get all the roots out, because you want to do that as well. Grazing is a great tool to control to weed infestation, but again, you need to know what the weed is, make sure they're not toxic to the livestock, and then just think about what's the right animal to graze on the right species. So everybody always likes to get goats, and goats are definitely more effective on brush, but cattle and sheep can be effective on grass. So if you had yellow star thistle, cattle and sheep can graze yellow star thistle early on. It has high protein, but you're going to have to do a little bit more controlled grazing and almost high densities in a smaller area to get the livestock to graze those areas that you want. So you want to do that thinking about the right livestock to the right species that you want to target. There are chemical methods to use as well. And like I said, you want to make sure you're using the right chemical. You want to make sure that you're doing it at a time that you're not having to use a lot of chemicals. So spraying when it's in the very small, in the rosette stage, making sure that you're using enough to get the full species. And you think about, do I want a pre-emergent, something like Milestone or Transline that'll kind of get yellow star as it's germinating, or is it a post-emergent? That's something that's already germinated, it's in the rosette stage, and I can spray that. What you don't want to do is when you see the thistles all tall and going to seed, to say, oh, now I'm going to spray, because that's just too much herbicide, and you really should have done a lot more ahead of time. So you want to know what the life cycle is. You want to know, when's the best time in that species to control, and what's the best tool. So if I want to mow it, I want to mow it before it goes to seed, so I don't spread the seed all over. I might have to mow it twice because they might regrowth. So it's a balancing act on making sure that your efforts provide success. And what you ultimately end up is wanting something like a working rangelands that's either great for wildlife habitat, or it's great for grazing. It provides a great fire fuel break by providing grazing. You have healthy ecosystem services, sequestering carbon, lots of those things. And so you could do nothing because it's just too overwhelming. And then you're going to have a whole lot of weeds that you're going to have to control, and you've lost that beautiful habitat that you had, the habitat for the wildlife, your feed for your livestock, additional fire fuels for the next fire. that we unfortunately may or may not have. And so think about, what could I do? And then you're going to get a variety of different plants that you never saw. I mean, this is turkey mullein. And so, maybe that's not so noxious, but it's not a good species for for habitat. And so thinking about how can I prevent this from happening? Or you get just fields and fields of yellow star thistle, and that doesn't help anything because it just takes over the land and you don't have the desired species that you want. And then we have to talk about, how can we work with our road crews, our neighborhoods to help control some of these roadside weeds infestations, because that's where a lot of the weeds are coming from, is that we're not able to control those weeds in a good fashion. And so trying to set up a neighborhood, a watershed plan that's going to address weed management going forward. There's a lot of weed control resources. This is a field guide that was created in the Central Sierra Nevada, and it's weeds, forages, and natives of Central Sierra Nevada. It's something I'd recommend if you're interested in that. We also have a really great website at UC Davis that talks about weeds and control. You can always call me, and if you have a weed, you could snap a picture of it, send it to me, and we'll try to, first and foremost, we want to get it identified. The Sonoma County Agriculture Department is another resource for you. And then of course the NRCS, or the Natural Resource Conservation Service, is another great resource as well, because some of these practices that you need to implement to control weeds could provide, the NRCS could provide a cost share. Also the RCDs are another great resource to help you kind of with your weed management plan, tying it into, what your goals and objectives are, and how to implement this calendar of weed control, implementing these different practices at the right time to get the best success out of it. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. There's my contact information, and be happy to answer any questions. And I think we have a quiz question too.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Yes, we have a quiz question. I'm going to launch the quiz now. Okay, the question is, why do weeds flourish after fires? And while people are taking the quiz, we have a question here in the chat that says, should eucalyptus be controlled as a weed?
I think a lot of it depends on what folks' goals are. I mean, eucalyptus are really fire prone. And so some people really like the eucalyptus. I could ask some of the tree guys that are on, what do they think about eucalyptus? I'm always concerned that they're so flammable. They're not native. And, it's something that I know what we've been looking at and taking quite a few of them out in certain areas where there are a large population of them.
Right, any other comments about eucalyptus from our speakers?
I'll chime in. One of the small problems with these kinds of questions is eucalyptus represents about 500 species. So it's really hard to generalize if we're going to talk about them as a botanical thing. But most of the time when people are talking, so pink ironbark, for instance, is very, very fire resistant. As the name suggests, the bark is incredibly hard and very difficult to set light to. But most people are talking about blue gum. And blue gum, I think Stephanie did a great job on answering it. It does depend upon what your goals are. But yeah, generally speaking, there's not a lot of really great, eucalyptus doesn't bring a whole bunch to the California landscape. One ecologist that I like to quote, basically said a eucalyptus grove in California has a biodiversity of a parking lot. So there's a reason right there you may not want it. And the blue gum is also, can it produce this bark that sheds abundantly and is kind of flammable. So blue gum can be maintained in a fairly fire safe condition, particularly when the trees get large. There's some trees up in Reebley Road that were clearly set on fire by the house, not the other way around. And these ukes were right next to the house. I mean, within that 30-foot zone that everybody talks about. You don't want these things there. So, but it was the house that set the ukes on fire, not the other way around. So just because they're ukes doesn't mean it's necessarily a nightmare. They can be maintained in a reasonably safe condition. But if you've got them small, take them out. That's my take. That's my personal take on that.
Great, thanks, Stephen. All right, so all of our respondents answered that the reason why weeds flourish after fires is because they have an abundant seed source and increased access to resources, and that is correct. Great job.
Yes, it is.
All right, I'm going to close the polls, and I will invite on our next speaker, Ellie Inslee. And Ellie, I'm going to provide you your slides momentarily. Okay.
Okay, good. I have a grand total of 1 slide. And I wanted to take the opportunity, and it's interesting, I don't know if Rich is still on the webinar, but he mentioned that installation of erosion control structures can be really problematic, and he's absolutely right. But I did want to mention that for toxic runoff from burned properties, it is actually really important to contain the toxins. And you can see the image on the left, the photograph is a wattle that's being installed. And these are straw sausages. And as Rich said, they filter the water through, but they hold the sediment and toxins in they're containing them. So when a house or a car burns, there's a good deal of toxic materials that are left on the site, and you want to keep those from flowing into the streams. So the county of Sonoma actually provided funds to 3 organizations, the Sonoma Ecology Center, Russian River Keepers, and Community Soil, to provide the resources and training, critically training, to landowners to put these straw wattles around the burned areas, where structures and vehicles have burned. So this is an ongoing project. I don't know how much the county provided this year, but they've been offering these 3 organizations funding so that when landowners have burned property, they can go out and teach people how to do it right. And I happen to be with the Sonoma Ecology Center, so I'm biased in saying that I know that our organization is really super careful in the way we instruct people. And we've had workshops in doing this. So if any of you have burned properties, then please, the glass fire area is covered by the Ecology Center, and you can go onto our website. This is going to be in a resources document that we send out to everybody who has signed up. And this is only one of about 15 different resources we have. The Wall Bridge fire is being handled by Russian River Keepers and Community Soil. So it's definitely a community project, because the wattle they weigh like 300 pounds. So we basically train people and then get crews together. So yeah, that's the main thing that I wanted to present. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Adriana. Thank you. And there's no quiz with this one. Lucky you.
Thanks, Ellie. All right, I'll give it to our next presenter, Fred Ufrat.
Let me share here and bring it up. So I'd like to just sort of do a little bit of a wrap up here. When everybody's been talking about you have to look at the larger process. If you just take a look at how it appears right now, you may not get a clear idea of what's going on over time. So we tend to just live in the perspective of the day, but we need to be a little bit longer term than that. So I want to address that sort of across the landscape and through time. So ecologically, let's see if we can do this. Forests are a piece of a larger continuum. And we think of that continuum with the grass and fireweed down here moving through time. So after a fire, we go either from an old growth situation or a redwood situation or a hardwood and Doug fir situation. We go back to the grass and fireweed situation, seeing seeing an ecological sort of journey here. So you can see I've got those worked out. I presume you can see that. We tend to think that we want the old growth, but we may not be able to get there. And even if we do want to get there, really it's part of a much larger cycle. And that's what I like to think of when I look at the land. Is it really a forest land without being a grassland and hardwood land and a shrubland as well? We want this old growth scene. We want these old growth 2,000-year-old trees, but sometimes we don't get to see them, or we get confused because they all look burned, and we don't know if it's going to be an old forest. Some places get stuck in being an earlier stage of forest. So ecologically, there may be a place with thin soils or dry soils, and it's never going to be an old growth forest. So we can't really expect that to occur. This one way to see this as islands of heterogeneity, little biodiversity shots that do different things across the landscape. Here's a picture with the beautiful flowers coming up in the middle of a clearing. Well, this clearing could have been created by a tree falling down in patch succession, group phase succession, so that really this is a hole in a larger forest. And we kind of have to see our full forests here as a set of holes, of patches and corridors, of networks, of various stages of various stages of ecological development. And as we go through that, we have to remember it's about people too. So our personal ecosystems are similarly developed. We could get to a place where we say, oh, this is the way I've always wanted to see it. But we don't know. The next day, we could be looking at something completely different, and it doesn't meet our expectations. But it's still our place, and it's still our place in the land. And we can still move forward. Here's what the site looks like when it's cleaned up. We can still move forward to get to the next generation. And that's what the trees are doing too. I hope you get a smile out of this. Just like the forests, our families are made up of the old growth and the young growth. So this is me and my step-great-grandchild-in-law. And we are coming back up through the generations, because just like a forest, it's about continuity. Now, this picture may look completely like a burned forest and a hollowed out stream, but look, the redwoods have grown 2 and 3 feet since the fire. So in the middle of a drought, we're still growing trees like crazy. Yeah, there's dead ones or damaged trees on top of the damaged stems, but those trees are still growing. Resprout, reseed. As we walk away, we see the areas that have been burned in wildfires. We forget that they're going to be reseeded with Douglas fir really fast, even those Douglas firs that are going to be dying. Those are among the species that really can recapture a site quickly. Here's a Doug fir that is recapturing a meadow up at Pepperwood, and it's much too quick for our tastes, frankly. And recover. Here is, in fact, a landscape at Pepperwood, and this landscape goes through fire. That's what it's all about. So the landscapes are built for recovery, and sometimes we forget that. Reconsider. There may be a way to take the landscape through those ecological systems, ecological stages, without having to go through something as drastic as a complete crown fire. These are some areas I was burning last winter, And these trees came through the fire pretty darn well because the area was prepared for it. Yes, it burned a lot lighter underneath just because of us doing a little fire. So there you go. Don't get biased by the perspective of the day and think of it as a circle, not a line. We're always going to come around. And when you get enough years on you, perhaps like myself, you can start to see how it just keeps going around. So recovery will occur, creating a new ecosystem. It's not going to be the same ecosystem. It's going to be a little different. But with those patches, those islands, those matrices and corridors, it's going to be a productive ecosystem. And I'm pretty excited about it. I'm pretty excited about the possibilities of recovery at this point. Well, I'm sort of losing my voice here, so I'm going to hand it back to Adriana. But thank you all for coming tonight, and feel free to contact me. My name and email are in the slide deck here. So with that, let's go back to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Fred. That was wonderful. And yes, we'll put the contact information for all the speakers in our resources document.
Thank you, Adriana. And thank you, audience. This is just so wonderful to be able to talk to you tonight.
Up next, I want to invite Roberta McIntyre. And Roberta, I'm going to share your slides now.
Okay, thanks, Adriana, and thank you all for spending your Thursday evening here. I know it's a long night, and I imagine some of you are having dinner while you're watching the presentation. So my name is Roberta McIntyre. I am the president and CEO of FireSafe Sonoma. We are a countywide fire safe council, and we've been around for over 20 years, believe it or not, sharing the good word of wildland fire safety. We mostly focus our education and outreach on the built environment and life safety. But I do want to echo a lot of the comments that were made tonight. Well, first of all, I want to share with you, that what to expect this winter. And, I went on the NOAA site earlier today and pulled down this graphic, and it shows what we can expect. This is a long range forecast for the US. And if you look at the graphic, you can't see it very well, unfortunately, but basically it's showing us that we're, for the next 3 months, in for some really dry months when we're not supposed to have dry months. And I think I heard the other day on NPR on their news something to the fact that we just experienced the warmest November on record, which is just total crazy. So that's okay, Adriana. Oh, that's better a little bit. Yeah. But yeah, the green is the rainfall, the gray is normal, and the brown is lack of precipitation. So it's a precipitation probability. So it's showing us that, even where we are in the Bay Area, we're not as bad as way down south, but we're not great either. So that's something to be aware of moving forward into the future. So let's go ahead and flip to the next slide, and I'll jump into my bullet points. All right, thanks. So lessons learned from our prior fire experiences. It's been really well emphasized tonight. Let's don't overdo erosion control measures because they can make things worse. Don't remove trees unless they're a hazard. And Fred, maybe you can help me out with this, or someone else who's more of an expert on these things than I am. But I read in a report recently about the importance of keeping burned trees standing as long as they don't pose a safety hazard, because it actually provides habitat for birds like woodpeckers. And actually, I look out my window at my home, and across the street, I have a telephone pole where a woodpecker lives, and I get to watch that bird play all day, which is fun. But can Fred, you or one of the other experts confirm that, or is it's okay to leave, burned trees standing, right? As long as they don't have snags that'll drop on you, or as long as they're not going to fall over in a wind. So anyway, all right, I'll leave that open-ended. And then, as was mentioned earlier, do remove those invasive plants early, and, get a head start on that. And then more in my wheelhouse is communicate with your neighbors and technical assistance providers. When you're talking about, your defensible space in your built environment, this presentation isn't meant to focus on the built environment, but certainly when you're talking about your defensible space, and if you want some expertise about that, feel free to reach out to us at Fire Safe Sonoma, as well as there's other experts, CAL FIRE, Permit Sonoma is not a bad resource. If you can get a hold of the fire marshal there, some of the planners there can offer advice as well. And let's see. Yeah, and with regard to funds, I think I have that on another slide. If not, though, with regard to accessing funds for projects with Fire Safe Sonoma, we do a fair amount of grant applications, and we have done some outreach and education with folks on how to do grants, and we've assisted other folks with putting in grant applications. But one of the things that just drives me nuts is almost always it feels like, we'll get people say, hey, there's this grant coming up. We should apply for it. Let's get to work and figure something out. That's not the way to do it, you guys. If you need funding for a project, then go and get the funding for that project. But have the project first. Do a needs assessment. And go ahead and flip to the next slide if you don't mind, Adriana. I think I'm segueing into that. So just just back to the grant application, have a project built first. A project for a grant application is basically a business plan. Have it built, do your needs assessment. With regard to the CWPP, it's going to be very important to be involved in the countywide CWPP, which is coming up. But in addition to that, there are several local CWPPs. The CWPP, by the way, is a community wildfire protection plan. And the county has one. Fire Safe Sonoma was instrumental in creating the first one. I think we signed it, the signatories signed it in 2016, I think. And so that's there. The county has received funding and has just appointed a contractor to do a rewrite of this countywide CWPP. So where I'm going with that is the CWPP, whether it's the countywide CWPP or a local CWPP that's been done, and like I said, we've done a few of those. Those are your blueprints towards projects. So segueing all that back into the grant application piece. So the CWPP will provide a mostly objective analysis of what you need to do for your county, if it's countywide, and for your community, if it's a community local CWPP. So that's your blueprint on what you need to do to reduce risk of wildland fire in your community, whether it's a forest thinning project, a shaded fuel break, whatever, that the work that goes into a CWPP, that plan will show you what you need to do. And then once you've done a CWPP and I have identified ways to mitigate what you discover as issues or risks in your community, then you go get the grant funding or other funding to apply towards those projects that you've already identified. And that's the from here to there. And there, it feels like there's not as many grant opportunities these days as there used to be. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're competing with COVID funding, et cetera, et cetera. However, they're still out there. They're very competitive, which is another reason to have a good plan to fall back on. Most of the grant applications that I've been associated with ask you to relate your project to a local plan of some kind of risk assessment. And most of the time it's a local or county CWPP. So with that said, I'm just going to round this all out. There is a likelihood of future fires. We're going to have more fires. I feel like I've been reading a lot about some of this stuff. The people on this panel know a lot more about this forest management stuff than I do, but I've been reading up on it a lot. And one of the things I think I'm discovering is that what's happening now in the Western states is part of what's called a fire regime. And it's been happening for forever, since the planet, was first formed. And in the timeline of the earth, we're just a little tiny piece of it. And in our little piece of that timeline, we're experiencing what we think are very terrible, giant, awful fires. But I'm coming to believe that it's just nature doing what nature has to do. And so we're going to have more fires. They're going to happen. It's not, your property might burn again. It's your property probably will burn again. Maybe not in our lifetime. Hope not. Probably will in some way, shape, or form. But in terms of the built environment and the forest near the built environment, there are things we can do. In terms of the built environment, when I do my slideshow or my presentation on structural hardening, I have an image I use, and the image I use is the moon. And I say, look, you guys, if this is the environment you're putting a structure in, you don't put up a cardboard box up and call it good. And then the next image I show is the lunar lander. And I go, you build like this, you build for that environment. So if you're building a house in an environment where it's the forest, building it all out of wood probably isn't a great idea. We need to build for the environment where we're putting that structure in. And then with regard to global warming trends, it's, we can all dispute, about the degree human influence has had on global warming, but global warming is real, it's happening, and that is having an impact on our lifestyle in our little piece of the timeline where we're here on the life of the planet. So it is impacting what's going on with these forests. So what are we doing to prevent future fire? Once again, back to the CWPP, that for Fire Safe Sonoma, the countywide CWPP and local CWPPs, those are our roadmaps to success. The projects that go into those are, like I say, they're mostly objective based, and they're real. Go ahead, next slides, please. I think I'm about finished with my blah, blah, blah.
That is the last slide.
Yeah, that's the last slide. Okay, so we're good. So that's really all I have to say. I just, other than just echoing, what the other folks were saying. Basically let nature do it. I liked what Richard said about having an evacuation plan. To me, that's one of the most important things. I am looking at the built environment and the folks that have homes and buildings in that environment on that scale of communities, like I used to look at a building when I was the county fire marshal and a fire inspector. When I would look at a building, if I got a set of building plans for new commercial building or project, one of the first things I check is their means of egress. So I check and look and see if their exiting system is going to work for the number of people that they're putting in a building. It's called an egress system. To me, that's the most important feature of any building. If people can get out of the building and the building burns to the ground, okay, we didn't kill anybody. That's the most important thing. And I'm using that philosophy when I look at the forest and the built environment in the forest and the fires we're experiencing today. I'm looking at it from the point of view of number one, most important thing in these communities is to get those people out of there as quickly as we can. Early detection, you know, like a fire alarm systems, early detection, or early warning systems to evacuate, or, you know, SOCO alert, Nixle, all those resources that we have available, use them all. So thank you, Richard, for bringing that up to have an evacuation plan. And then I like what essentially what somebody else said. You know, if it isn't nature, don't put it back. You know, if it's not a native plant, my recommendation is don't put it back. But if you're gonna put plants back, use natives. And then the last thing I'm gonna leave you with is buildings don't grow back. So if you are rebuilding, even if you're not in a WUI, take precautions in your new building to, you know, prevent, you know, build in, you know, fire resistant construction, or what we call fire hardening or structural hardening these days. If you do nothing to a new house that you built, if there's only one thing I should say that you do, I would say at least put in approved attic venting, you know, the approved venting, because in the Bay Area, studies have shown that the leading cause of structure loss is embers getting into a house in the attic or through an open window or otherwise. It's the embers that get into the building and the homes burn from the inside out. So I'll leave it with that. Buildings don't grow back, plants do. Don't put back crappy plants, put back native plants. And if you need more information, feel free to contact Fire Safe Sonoma anytime. So thanks again. Yeah, that's all I have.
Thanks,
Thank you for
Roberta.
inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for summarizing some of the things that we learned through the workshop, and also taking us forward into thinking about prevention and planning. And I want to mention that we will be having a workshop in the spring talking more in detail about prevention and planning. So please all join us for that as well. Okay, so I'm going to now launch our final poll. This one is a set of questions just to help us evaluate how this workshop has met your needs. So I'll give everyone just a few minutes for your 5. Everything's anonymous, by the way, and it just helps us kind of evaluate how we've done and to see what else, what other help you all need. And then once I've gathered all these questions, I'll officially kind of open the floor for us to do a larger Q&A with all of our speakers. So any lingering questions, feel free to ask your speakers at this time. And again, if you're someone who likes to kind of digest information, sleep on it, you can do that, because we're going to provide you with the contact information for all the speakers. You can get in touch with them later down the road. Right. Just give us another minute to complete this poll. All right, we've got a good number of responses in, and thank you all for taking the time to provide us with that information. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to kick off our Q&A session with a question that I really want to hear our speakers talk about, which is, can you speak a little bit about the opportunities for working with your neighbors? Each of you think about your different topics and the different ways that a victim of a fire might want to work with their neighbors to build back better. And I'll let whoever wants to answer that question first, go ahead and kick us off.
I guess I can start. Rich Cassell. I've been working with a lot of community groups. In fact, when people call in and want a site visit, I ask them a little bit about their property and about the neighboring properties, and I get them to help organize the neighborhood. So when I go out and meet and do a site assessment, I'm actually meeting everyone all at once instead of individually. And it's a perfect time for some neighbors to meet each other for the very first time, which is kind of cool and kind of weird on another level, just because they may have been neighbors for 10 years, but this fire has brought them together. But hearing the information that needs to be done on the landscape altogether, instead of that information being relayed from one neighbor to another, makes it more real and pertinent and understandable, especially if it comes from a reliable source. So that's one approach that's worked out really well, as well as whatever the measure is. If there's measures, then we have the permission from the property owners, and they're all on board to do some measure that may overlap from property to property. And if not, if the presentation is do nothing, then everybody gets that message together instead of someone clearing vegetation and somebody not clearing vegetation. So I can't overemphasize the importance and the need of working on a community and neighborhood and just neighbor to neighbor basis of really getting more accomplished in a post-fire landscape.
Great, thank you. Maybe one or two other comments on the importance of working with neighbors before we move on to questions from our attendees. No? Okay. If there's no one else who wants to comment on that, just want to thank you, Rich, for your answer. And I have a question here in the chat that asks, this one's for Rich Cassell. How do you see the role of biochar in restoration?
I see there is a role for biochar. We've actually seen it used in actually straw wattles and in compost wattles, and so yeah, I am very open to incorporating all sorts of new technologies and methods and things certainly that have a biological connection to the stimulating the regrowth and the regeneration of the environment following fire. But yeah, definitely. I mean, it's quite a hot topic right now, and I'm really excited about it.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, we're kind of a small group. If anyone has a question that they want to ask, just by turning on their mic, and feel free to just shout out your question. Otherwise, you can use the chat box to ask. And yeah, if there are no other questions, we'll wrap up early, but we'll just, I'll give us a minute to brainstorm a few questions before we close. Well, I guess one question that I have is, I just wonder if any of the presenters feel like, as they were listening to each other's presentations, did you see any areas for conflict? Like advice from one speaker might have kind of conflicted with advice from another speaker? Not that I'm calling you guys out on it, but just thinking about, like, is there anything that attendees might have felt was like a little confusing, or anything that you want to clarify?
I think the invasive plant issue can be conflicting. It's a very site-specific call, because I've worked with plant ecologists in the field. They've been out in the field with me, and they they kind of take center stage when they see, invasive plants on the post-fire landscape, maybe ones that weren't burned or ones that are already starting to regenerate. And they're really, you want to emphasize to the property owner to get rid of those plants. And I don't have a problem with it where it isn't going to create a slope disturbance or potentially an erosion issue or other problem, but it's a really site-specific call. And like I said, I think any plant is a good plant initially right after fire, especially when we have fires late in the season in the fall going into the first winter. And those plants were there before. And, it seems like a perfect time to get rid of them. And certainly the fire has helped knock down their population. But again, I'm still worried about the disturbance of removing large populations of invasive plants when the rest of the drainage area or the watershed or the slope has been compromised or completely destroyed by fire. So not that there isn't a place for it. I'm just saying it's a site-specific call.
Adriana, I felt for the most part quite the opposite. As I was listening to the presentations, I felt like they were reinforcing each other. That the concepts and everything they were basically saying very much the same kinds of things or prescribing to the same philosophy. And I think the through line for most of the discussion was just let nature do what it's got to do. That's my big takeaway.
Yeah. Yeah, great. I saw that Paula Craig had a question she wanted to ask.
Well, I might have missed some of what they were just talking. I might have touched on this, but because I had to run out for a second. But when there was a point made about that sometimes there's an area that burned so hot that it just completely killed everything. There is no seed to regrow. There's nothing, and we have some areas like that, and and one of them is hillside too. We're not so, it's pretty rocky, so we're not so worried about slide and things like that. And we've even we've had engineers here, and they're not too worried. But just as far as regrowth, I mean, there's just nothing, and should we still just wait and watch, or yeah, I see you nodding. Or is it just really dead? Is it just gonna be, like those areas in the world that just died and didn't come back? I don't know.
If I can address a little of that, we're talking about forest restoration and regeneration here. And yeah, you're going to have some places which are going to not have any trees in them. And while bays may resprout, madrones don't. Tan oaks will resprout a little bit, but they'll get sudden oak death probably and keel over from that. Maple could come back, but you can always plant some more. Redwoods, it's a great time to plant redwoods, and you can do that in lower parts of your area and feel like you're really getting something done, because when you come back in a few years, those trees will continue to grow. So this is a great opportunity to take advantage of the bare ground. We're telling you, you don't have to freak out and try and cover the ground, but if you want to get some trees in, this is a great time to do it.
So do plant then.
Absolutely. If you have an area that is relatively handleable, if you will, and can find a good seed source or a good seedling source for some stuff you'd like to put in the ground, this is an opportunity. But it doesn't mean that if you don't do something, it'll be terrible. Maybe this is a great opportunity for that. And there's some great nurseries around, like Calflora, that have those pieces of vegetative material, plants, they're called.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. We have another question in the chat that says, can you give examples of how landowners might have incentive to work together? And can you explain the various benefits of working at scale? I'll leave that up to any speaker who wants to answer.
Here, I can bounce into that one too. Right now, we're working with our next door neighbor on getting access throughout the property. And our properties used to be one, so the road kind of meanders back and forth. Well, we're both opening up sides of it and creating good pathways for logs to get down and for waste vehicles and rock vehicles to get across the lands. It's a great time to take down our fences. I'm sure that they'll be going back up again soon. So landowners can work together on things like water, roads, rock, buying vegetation together, buying erosion control for critical areas together, working with Natural Resource Conservation Service in tandem with projects, working with forestry, Department of Forestry together in projects. And that's just some of the ways that landowners can work together. It's always cheaper by the dozen.
Yeah,
And also including salvage logging on small acreages. If a bunch of small acreage landowners get together, they can make a project worthwhile by working together on larger acres to do salvage logging, where it might not be economically feasible on a few acres, but you expand it to 50 or 100 acres and all of a sudden it's viable.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned, I was just going to mention that, Richard. Adriana and I think we're in a discussion not long ago where we were talking about the possibility of getting several property owners together and doing a forest management plan together. And there's the benefits of doing things as a group like that with regard to those kinds of things. The other thing that I think is imperative is getting everybody together. If you're working on a local community wildfire protection plan, it requires, input from all of the community. So and it's a good way to get folks introduced to each other as well, if you endeavor to create a local plan.
Great, awesome answers, thank you. Well, we're just about at the top of the hour, so I'm gonna respect everyone's time and just give a big thank you to our presenters and a thanks to all of the attendees for coming tonight. It was a really good event. I'm really happy that we were able to share this out, and that it'll be available to everyone after the fact on our website. So you'll be able to see a recording of this event on sonomaforest.org and share it with your friends and neighbors who weren't able to attend. So thanks everyone, and have a good night.
Adriana, thank
Adriana.
you so much for emceeing this whole thing. Well done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well done, Adriana, and thank you
Adriana. Thank
all
you.
for hanging in there.
Thank you, everybody. Really.
Thank you.